We'll begin and just begin with two announcements. Announcement number one is that on the 12th of July, a little over a month from now, we are having another online talk, this time by an American Protestant who lives in Poland, or has lived in Poland for many years, and he is quite an expert on Polish, Jewish, Christian relations, as well as in his former life as an academic. He was a medievalist, and so he knows a lot about Poland's conversion to Christianity and all that went with it. So he's going to give us a spiritual survey of Poland, starting with, if I'm not mistaken, 966, when Poland officially starts its process of conversion. Talk about Poland during the Reformation, and kind of ironically, not ironically, quite surprisingly, nobody in Poland died in the Reformation or the Counter-Reformation. The Polish nobility and their invitation to the Jewish people to come live in Poland, the place of the Roman Catholic Church today in Poland, and maybe a little bit on John Paul II. So it's a spiritual survey. It'll help us to be better prepared for the tour itself. And for those who have been on the tour, I have no doubt that you should also find this quite interesting. And I know I'm talking to a bunch of alum, but if there's anybody out there who loves doing things at the last minute and would like to sign up, there's still room and there's still time. We don't have a lot of room, but we do, or you do, still have time if you would like to sign up. Okay. I think since most of us are Christians, I don't think it would be appropriate to pray. So let's start. So, Father in heaven, we ask that as we deal with history and geography and all these things, we pray that this will help us to see a big picture. It'll help us to see the challenges and dangers of the times in which we live. And Lord, we pray that from all of this, for each one of us, there will be something practical that will help us to address the issues that we face in our day and time. And we do ask this for the sake of your Son, Jesus of Nazareth. Amen. Okay. All right. So I'm going to begin, and we just make sure that so start with some quotes, and this is from my beloved professor from Hebrew University. He's still alive, but he's retired. He's a South African Jew who specializes in German Jewish history or European Jewish history. And he warned us once in class, and I wrote this down, not exactly, but close enough. Don't read history backwards. Auschwitz happened, but not everything that happened before Auschwitz, okay, led to Auschwitz. Okay, so we have all of these. We have many people using different historical examples, something that may have happened in Germany before the First World War, or something that happened in Austria, and automatically we assume that all these things had to lead up to not only the war, but to the murder of the Jewish people. So that's a very good caution as we set out on this journey. Secondly, the second quote. All right. So our our you might say our satirist Karl Kraus. He said the streets of Vienna are paved with culture. The streets of other city are paved with asphalt. I think we'll come back to this, but not only was Vienna, of course, known for culture, we also have to remember that as Europe became secular, people stopped going to church, but they didn't stop looking for transcendence. And transcendence, especially in many Central European countries, Germany, Austria, and more, was found in art and culture and music. So instead of going to the church to hear Mozart's beautiful Requiem went from a liturgical setting, a church setting, into the concert hall, right? So we can see this process of secularization, yet at the same time, people still have this yin, either for religiosity or spirituality, all right? Then here's our Karl Kraus again. He was quite cranky and miserable and had some weird quirks about him, but he was quite incisive in understanding the age in which he lived. So Vienna is a research laboratory for world destruction, right? And why did he say this? He said this because he was a severe critic of the extremist politics, right? That Vienna sort of nurtured, thanks in part to the tolerance and the passivity of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and maybe even the emperor himself, Franz Joseph II. He was not a fan of psychoanalysis, which we'll talk about later. He was a stinging critic of occultism, which we will also address later. He despised the political philosophy of Wagner and Nietzsche, who were two that celebrated, the irrational and the mystical. And while he was not a Zionist, he spent his time defending the Jewish people against anti-Semitism. Karl Kraus was Jewish, but somewhere along the way he went down to the baptismal font and became a Lutheran. I'm not sure if the conversion was out of for ideological reasons or theological reasons, or if it was simply a matter of convenience. He wanted to assimilate into Gentile society, but he was, by the end of his life, he was considered to be a Christian. Okay, and next, maybe I can do it. I don't know. So next quote. I decide who is a Jew. This was the famous mayor of Vienna who ruled the city during the very years that Adolf Hitler lived in Vienna. And Karl Kraus was, you might say, the grandfather of the modern political anti-Semitism. And he unknowingly was the teacher of Adolf Hitler. He was he was an anti-Semite, not conviction. He was an anti-Semite out of convenience. He used it as a political tool in order to gain power and to stay in power. And after spending the day criticizing the Jews and telling the whole city of Vienna how horrible they were, he would go and dine with wealthy Jews. And when people began to criticize him, he snapped and said, "I decide who's a Jew." All right, so we'll come back to Karl Lueger in a moment. Okay, and one more. In Berlin, the situation is serious but not desperate. In Vienna, the situation is desperate but not serious. And this quote from an Alfred Polgar highlights, you might say, a certain passivity or a certain people who have resigned to their fate. Viennese society, many parts of Viennese society, you might say, had a sense, premonition that something bad is about to happen. But a little bit like Scarlett O'Hara and Gone with the Wind, I'll think about it tomorrow. All right, and so Vienna continued to dance and to waltz and to celebrate carnival, even though there was this sense they were dancing on the edge of an abyss. And this sort of indifference, especially found in the ruling elites, the aristocracy, was something that especially Karl Kraus hated. He hated the passivity. He hated the you might say the pessimism, right? The cultural pessimism, right? There's nothing I can do about this. It's just going to happen, and I might as well enjoy myself until it does. Okay, those are the quotes. Okay, all of these will become relevant to us. Here's a picture. Here's a picture of Karl Kraus. The map of Europe highlights in green the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At its height, it was one of three empires in Europe before the First World War. There was a Russian Empire, there was a German Empire. By November the 11th, 1918, all three empires, yes, were destroyed, or you might say had imploded, and the system of nation states that we know today rises in Europe. What was so amazing about this empire was its diversity, and it was at its height 53 million people. There were 15 nationalities, 11 were recognized, and it was said that an officer in the army of Austria-Hungary had to be able to issue commands in 11 languages. Okay, so we're talking about we are talking about a nation made up not just of Germans and Hungarians. We're talking about Poles, huge number of Poles, Croats, Slovenes, Slovakians, Czechs, Romanians, Ukrainians, Serbs, Turks, Jews, and more. Most of the population was Roman Catholic, but there were quite a few Protestants, Orthodox Christians, Jews. As you can imagine, there wasn't a sense of national identity in this empire. The idea of having one identity, like a nation state such as France might have, or the United States, did not exist. There was a certain loyalty, especially to the emperor, to Franz Joseph II, and the most supportive group in the empire, the group that actually supported this system, or perhaps the most loyal of all its subjects, were the Jews. You're talking about an empire that a system that was fairly tolerant, an emperor who was not an anti-Semite, Franz Joseph, an empire that somewhat guaranteed, Jewish rights and protection. And as we'll see in a minute, the Jews had most of the Jewish population had a very essential reason for holding up or trying to support the imperial system. Benno, can I see the second map, please? No, there's no. Okay, I don't know. Maybe you don't have it. Okay,
You only have one map.
all right. So then we come to Vienna, and Vienna, and it was the capital, again, not just of a nation, it was the capital of an empire, right? 15 different ethnic groups. It's, of course, the center of commerce and government, and it becomes the magnet, really, for some of the most talented people, right? All over the empire. Many of them end up in Vienna, and it's the diversity, this mix of different populations that becomes not just a laboratory for world destruction, but also becomes a laboratory for creativity. Some of that creativity was healthy. Some of it perhaps was unhealthy. It was truly a multicultural city, again, with 10% of the population of Vienna being Jewish. It becomes a haven for dissidents, dreamers, would-be artists, et cetera, et cetera. There are two Viennas, and this is kind of important to keep in mind. There's the Vienna of the three composers that you're looking at, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. There's the Vienna of the Ringstrasse, the Vienna of the Hofburg, the palace, the Burg Theater, the Opera House. There's Vienna Glorioso, glorious, beautiful Vienna, right, with its parks and its charming gardens and its wine taverns on the outskirts of town, et cetera, et cetera. This is the Vienna that the tourists like to go to. It was also a city with the largest, probably the largest, it was a European city with the largest number of poor in Europe, meaning the percentage of those who were poor, who barely eked out a living, people who generally work 7 days a week or 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, a city that had very poor medical services for most of the population, a city with a high crime rate, a city that was known for being a magnet for prostitutes. Vienna was probably this European center for prostitution. So there was something very ugly and dark about Vienna, while at the same time, right, there's something very glorious. At the same time, Vienna attracts, and here, by the way, is the Emperor Franz Joseph, who was kind of a cranky conservative, yet at the same time extremely tolerant and committed to the well-being of his 53 million subjects. Okay. So at the same time, Vienna grows. In fact, with the reason for so much poverty, a lack of housing, lack of services, lack of public transportation, was that Vienna grew by 2.5-fold in the last half of the 19th century, and by 1900 there was 1,700,000 residents of the city. Only half of the population, or less than half of the population, yes, were native born. So Vienna is, again, this magnet that attracts people from all over the empire. Towards the end of the 19th century, it starts to attract a lot of Jews, especially from the Russian Empire, as there are pogroms and oppression of the Jewish population in the Pale of Settlement in Western Russia. Many Jews from Russia and from southern Poland start ending up in Vienna. So there's an explosion, not just of the population, but there's also an explosion of the Jewish population. Okay, and it attracts revolutionaries. Right, this, you might say, this sort of tolerance or a sort of a laissez-faire attitude of what happens. So you have this incredible constellation of troublemakers, you might say. Well, maybe they're not all troublemakers. In 1913, yes, in a short period of time, you have Adolf Hitler, yes, Joseph Stalin, Leon Trotsky, yes, Joseph Tito, and Sigmund Freud. They all live within a few miles of each other, yes, and they all drink coffee at coffee shops, okay, that are very close by. So Stalin, Trotsky, right, Russian revolutionaries on trying to escape, being arrested by the Tsar. Adolf Hitler, a bohemian bum, trying to get into to the Academy of Art. Again, Tito, a revolutionary socialist, right, who will eventually become the leader of Yugoslavia. And we don't know what happened. We're not sure if Lenin himself, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, if he actually spends time in Vienna. It's a bit uncertain. But again, whether you were a conservative reactionary or someone who was on the border of being sort of a fascist, or you were a communist, a leftist, a socialist, right? You could find a haven in Vienna, right? And what did many of these so-called revolutionaries do, especially when they're in Vienna? Well, they would write articles, but they would also show up at Vienna's large number of coffee shops, drink coffee, right? Read newspapers, and hold debates, okay, with their friends. Yeah. So Ben, is there another? This is a map that just shows the coffee, shows where at least Hitler, Freud, Trotsky, and Stalin, right, would drink coffee. Okay. Okay. And again, Vienna then and now is famous for its coffee shop the coffee shop, a coffee shop lifestyle, you might say. Um, Now, just to go to with all these ethnic groups, yeah, with all the the you might say with all these different ethnic groups, which again there was created this diversity did spark a lot of creativity in the arts and sciences. For example, Vienna during this time was the world's leading center, right, for medical advancement. It wasn't the United States or Britain. If you wanted to know what the latest developments were in surgery, for example, or in treating diseases, you would go to Vienna and consult the medical school or the experts there. It also came with a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety. And what happened, excuse me, what happened was, or what begins to happen, is that amongst the German-speaking population, right, there is this deep fear that they're going to lose their position, right, of privilege within the city and within the empire. They feel that they're being overwhelmed, for example, by the Czechs or by the Hungarians. And when the Czechs come to live in Vienna, they're going to work for lower wages. There's a fear regarding, economic competition from Jews. So small business owners or small shopkeepers, right, are all of a sudden fearful about their future because there are Jews who are opening department stores. There are Jews and others who are calling for labor to be unionized. So you have the middle classes, yes, afraid of socialism or afraid of unionization. And amongst all this, there's this sense that if we're losing our place in the empire and we're losing our identity, and I should mention one more thing, is 1907, universal suffrage is introduced, meaning every male, not females, yes, from any background, is allowed to vote. And so you can imagine that in Vienna and throughout the empire, right, the position of German speakers is going to be diluted even more. And so where are we going to find security? Where will we find our identity? Because it's hard to find an identity to understand who we are, right? In this great big diverse empire, we need to be reunited with Germany. Yes, Germany, which is now powerful, very powerful, the most powerful country on the European continent, a country that is industrializing and progressing, at breakneck speed, a country that has an incredible army. Well, security for German speakers in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and in Vienna is going to best be found, yes, it's going to be found by being reunited with Germany. And so these are the fears, especially of a German-speaking, you might say, German-speaking minority. Now, keep in mind that while there is a rudimentary democracy of some kind and there is a parliament, most of the power is in the hands of the Habsburg aristocracy. In England, for the most part, they are German speakers. Like all the ministers of the different various government departments, government ministries are appointed by the emperor. They all have an aristocratic background, right? So in a sense, um, things for the German-speaking minority might be safe. But yet there's the beginning of a lot of ethnic tension starting at the turn of the century. And while many people can say, yes, the emperor is a good guy and this is sort of a good thing, right? The spirit of the age, right, is now is one of nationalism. And so the Czechs are wanting independence, and the Italians are wanting independence. And the Poles, yes, because the empire rules over southern Poland, the Poles, want to be, reunited, and they want to have independent, their own independent country again. And so the empire is starting to fray. It's starting to be pulled apart, all right, by all these different all these different ethnic groups. And where you see this most tragically is in the parliament, right? The diet of the empire, which is seated in Vienna. And here you have, again, 15 different ethnic groups, and people are oftentimes elected, or parties enter into the political system, right, based on their ethnic identity, right? So it is identity politics. Now, you might have some groups like the socialists who try to, or the religious parties like that support the Roman Catholic Church. They try to be more universal, although they only partially succeed. And so now you have all this political infighting in one building. And for example, when a bill came up to recognize the Czech language as an official language in parts of Bohemia, where there were many German speakers, well, Parliament descended into an absolute, three-ring circus, right? So there was yelling and screaming, and some of the parliamentarians got into fistfights. And whenever your opponent got up to speak, you would blow bugles and whistles, and it became such a childish spectacle that for entertainment, you might want to go and spend an afternoon watching a parliamentary debate, because the antics were going to be anything but dignified. And one of those who would go and watch these debates was the young bum, Bohemian, right, Adolf Hitler. And he concluded, from this experience alone, that democracy doesn't work, right? Because whatever was on display there at the Viennese parliament was a pretty poor representation, of parliamentary democracy. So the empire is fraying. It doesn't appear that it's going to stay together. There are language wars and more between different groups. And yes, you might say that the community that feels this the most acutely are the Jews of the empire. So this was summed up for us in a way by Theodor Herzl. So we all know Theodor Herzl, or we all heard that Theodor Herzl was impacted by the Dreyfus trial and French anti-Semitism. That may be true. That is true, but that's probably wasn't Herzl's main motivation. right, for for launching the Zionist movement. He believed that the ground was burning under his feet because the empire, yes, was about to fall apart, and he would know because he was a political correspondent for his newspaper, so he got to see up close and firsthand, right, the you might say the identity politics that were at play, that were ripping the empire apart. And he knew, right, that when the empire split up and separated, the Jews would have no place to go. So, for example, in Prague, which had a large Czech population and a large German population, the Germans and the Czechs were fighting with each other constantly. And the Jews, basically, of the city said, we're German. We speak German. We admire German culture. We admire Germany itself. We want to be included, right? When this thing breaks up, we want to be counted among the German community. Well, the Germans in Prague said to the Jews, you're not Germans. And so Jews eventually, I'm making this simple, but eventually talked to the Czechs, and the Czechs said, well, you're not Czechs, right? And so again, Herzl understood that the Jewish people had to leave Europe, Central Europe. He did not think about the Jews leaving the United States or Britain, had to leave the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire, right, before these these two giants collapsed or imploded upon themselves. And that's why he launched, yes, that's why he wrote this book, the Judenstaat, right? Not the Jewish state, but he wrote this book. He wrote it, you might say, the state of the Jews. All right, the state of the Jews. I think for Herzl, this was not going to be a Jewish state ruled by halacha, but it was going to be a state ruled by Jews with different traditions, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, Herzl is something to keep in mind. Herzl envisioned a state, and he envisioned the city of Jerusalem, something very much like the best of Vienna, and something very much like the best of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. It's going to be cosmopolitan and tolerant, and he didn't have any notion that people would speak one language. They speak 3 or 4 languages, and was going to be cultured, like Vienna was going to be cultured, and much more. And this is where he needed the help of his good buddy at the time, William Henry Heschler, who was the Anglican chaplain to the British Embassy in Vienna. And I'm going to come back to Heschler in a couple of minutes. But Herzl went to meet Heschler, and he told Heschler, I need you to help me make contact with important people in Europe so I can explain my idea, which is to evacuate Jews from Europe as soon as possible. And in return, what this would do, this is what Herzl told the prime ministers and kings in Europe, this will relieve, yes, the pressure that is growing from anti-Semitism. Right, so you help us, we'll help you. This was Herzl's. Now, it's kind of important. People will ask, why was Herzl successful when there are others who came before him who had similar, you might say, Zionist ideas? Well, if you take a look at the next slide, this is a you might say, an interpretation of Theodor Herzl by the Zionist artist Ephraim Moshe Lilyan, who was one of the founders of the Bezalel School here in Jerusalem. And if you're talking about 1900 Vienna, you're talking about, yes, mass media right? For the first time in history, we have newspapers that are read everywhere by quite a few people. And Viennese newspapers, especially the New Free Press, was read by educated people, for example, all over Europe. But now you're dealing with a with an age, the age of images. You no longer can simply produce a newspaper or a journal or a magazine. It has to have illustrations, and and as we get closer to World War I, more and more newspapers will start to have photographs. Yes, you can't simply have text anymore. So here comes a revolution. And what does Herzl look like? Herzl is very distinguished looking. He has a lot of charisma. He can write well. He can speak well. He carries himself with an incredible amount of dignity. And he looks the part. He looks like a king. He looks like someone walking, you know, walking out of the pages of the Bible, right? He's a Moses, he's a David, he's a Solomon, and Herzl, again, in an age where image was important and mass media, right, is now you might say the latest development in the way that people communicate. Um, Herzl um, looks the part to the point that a lot of desperate Jews are going to to follow him, and even a number of Jews in Eastern Europe is going to think, this could be the Messiah, or this could be the this could be the Messianic age. Okay, so there's ethnic tension. So this is pulling the empire. This is pulling the empire apart. Uh, Again, the Slovakians want their own state, and the Croats are going to want their own country. The Italians are rebelling against the Austrians, and the Jews have no place to go. Herzl's going to solve the problem by taking Jews first to Argentina. But later, he reckons no one will follow him if he goes to Argentina. Finally, to Eretz Israel. Okay. Then let me go a little further. Okay. Okay. Next, I would say the next, if you have ethnic tension, ethnic hatred, you also have a bigger fear, and this isn't a fear shared by everyone, but this is the revolt against positivism. All right. So, what is positivism? Positivism is an enlightened is a philosophy of the Enlightenment, which basically says something is real only if it can be touched or seen or heard. Right? You take in knowledge through human intellect, and for the last 100 years or so, many educated Europeans would have suggested the world is progressing thanks to scientific observation. We're becoming more rational. We're becoming less religious. Certainly not superstition, right? And the need for religion and superstition is fading. And this approach was common amongst Jewish intellectuals, Gentile intellectuals. Right? There was Herzl's friend. His name was Max Nordau, and Max Nordau said, "If you can't touch it or you can't smell it, You can't see it or hear it. It isn't even worth mentioning, right? And so Nordau and others, he had no place for emotion or no place for, you might say, spirit. I'm using that with a small s. There was no impulse, right? You have to apply the laws of natural science, right, to all human behavior. So Europe, the intellectual life in Europe is going in this direction. And then there's a series, you might say, of shocks and you might say disruptions to life. And this is the shock of liberalism. And here I'm not using liberalism as it's used today, but this is a right change in society's attitudes, for example, towards religion, right, towards the place of women, towards perhaps sexuality, and it's the rise of capitalism. And all of this is starting to unnerve traditional society. People are becoming insecure. They feel like there's nothing certain anymore, right? My economic future, my social status, right? My place in this village, and more. And there's a rebellion against positivism, against this notion of progress or modernity, rationalism, education, right? And more. And this rebellion brings, hold on a minute with the pictures. This rebellion brings the glorification of, it brings the glorification of folklore. It brings the glorification of myth, emotion, mysticism, and magic, right? It's what, you know, what do you want to highlight? The things that are not sensible, the things that are not you might say, are not the conventional wisdom, because the conventional wisdom and what is rational has led us to, to the disaster that we now find ourselves in, right? Millions of people are unemployed because, they don't work, making clothes at home anymore. Right? You have to now go to a factory, which is dehumanizing. Um, and religion is being challenged, right, by all kinds of theories, for example, about the Bible, or about the origins of Christianity, or the origins of Judaism. And the people who lead this charge, you might say, it would be Nietzsche and Wagner, right? And you have folks like Sigmund Freud, who's quite worried, right, about, right, this whole trend. Why is everybody going crazy? Why has society become so irrational? Why is society celebrating the romantic, the irrational, the mystical, right? After all, right, for something to be real, it has to be verifiable. And now all of a sudden, here comes, right, this whole wave. And what's kind of central to this return, you might say, to the primitive, or this return to the irrational, is anti-Semitism. Because, right, society needs a scapegoat. Who's responsible for all these changes? Who's responsible for the capitalist system that we have at the moment, that is putting folks in factories working 6 or 7 days a week, 11 hours a day? Who's responsible for the banking system that every few years crashes like it still does today? Who's responsible for the stock market? Of course, it's Jews. Who's responsible uh, for labor unions and socialism? Well, it's also, the Jewish people, because we're being threatened by Marxism, we're threatened by socialism, we're being threatened by those who criticize, who are deconstructing religion. And in all of this, right, the buzzword is um, uh, is degradation. Okay, and this degradation is found in the cities. It is, for example, Max Nordau, right? He's a positivist. He's the associate of Herzl, and along with Theodor Herzl, he's the founder of the Zionist. He's the founder of the Zionist movement. But Max Nordau is a physician, and he talked about not only degradation, but he says this is to be found in the cities. He said the pace of life is unhealthy. All of the noise, the movement, people going back and forth, quickly, riding on trains, right, and going at a certain speed, the lack of connection between people. He highlighted, alcoholism or intoxication, drugs, um, people taking up smoking, even right, even the use of perfume. So, right, this is all a form of degeneracy. Right, society is collapsing. Society is falling apart, and again, the Jews are primarily responsible. And in Vienna, you have this sense in the late 19th century that the society is in a state of collapse. We're in a state of decline. We're becoming degenerate. We're becoming, immoral. And by the way, this was very selective about what they considered to be moral or what they considered to be immoral. It wasn't exactly what conservative Christians um, might define as moral and immoral today. And again, in the midst of the debate, yes, it's the Jews are the capitalists, the Jews are the journalists, the Jews are bringing new social ideas, right? The Jews are in the forefront of psychoanalysis. Oh, and psychoanalysis is ugly. Psychoanalysis, is debasing people, right? 90% of the early practitioners of psychoanalysis were Jews. 90% of their patients were Jewish, right? Jews are financing, right, degenerate forms of art and music. So let me show you an example, right? Let's go to the woman, with the silver. Okay, here's an artist. Oh, okay. So, okay, so here's an artist, the man who's the founder of Art Nouveau, Gustav Klimt, right, who departs from all most traditional convention, right? He doesn't create art as it was 100 years before his time. He has a new He's not going to paint reality as much as he's going to create reality together with his fellow artists. The art was criticized. At times it was considered to be too sensual, too again, too degenerate, too bold, too radical. So he painted, there's this woman by the name of Bauer. So she's a Jewish woman with wealth. She had wealthy parents, and these Jewish parents had them paint their daughter. There she is on the right, sometimes in the 1890s, and on the left, you can see her there in 1915. Well, this was considered scandalous at the time, right? Again, because of its lack of convention, its sensuality, and who's behind all these artists, or who's behind the new music, such as Mahler's music, right? You have Jewish patrons who are asking for commissions or sponsoring, the writing of new symphonies or song cycles, and they're done, right? And sort of oftentimes breaking a certain convention. Of course, today we consider Klimt and Mahler, right, to be geniuses, and we all appreciate their work, so on and so forth. But at the time, right, it was, Jews are somehow behind this. So, and as I mentioned to you, the socialist movements. And let's go back to Freud for a moment. So we think of Sigmund Freud in the United States as somebody who set out to solve our personal problems, right? We think of psychoanalysis as a tool to help us personally and individually, and that's because we come to it from sort of an American individualism. But actually, Freud, whatever we think of his theory, and this is why I find him so fascinating, Freud and his project was more or less involved than he was trying to investigate. Yes, why is the world becoming so irrational? Why is anti-Semitism becoming so irrational, right? Anti-Semitism used to simply be about the Jews killed Jesus, but the Jews rejected Jesus, right? Now anti-Semitism is something biological, and it's more than biological. It's that the Jews are promoting, this sort of decadency, where the Jews are on one hand behind capitalism, and they're also behind communism at the same time, right? None of this makes sense, right? Even if there are few Jews who are communists, hardly the vast majority of Jews were not communists or socialists, right? It's all becoming again very irrational, and Freud's very sensitive to this, and he's trying to come up, like others are. He's trying to come up with why is there a rebellion against logic? His answer, which has been you might say has been is no longer credible by virtually anyone, including those who call themselves Freudian psychologists and the Freudian school, is the issue for Freud was sex, right? And it was in part due to sexual repression. Vienna was a city where the aristocracy and the lower classes had no morals placed on them, right? If you were very rich or very poor, you could sort of do what you wanted. But if you were some in the middle class, you had to be respectable and to play by the rules of society. And there was a lot, you might say, a lot of angst uh, about sex. And just for the record, Freud wasn't someone advocating, uh, free love, or he understood that without restraint, especially on sexual behavior, uh, that civilization would fall apart, right? So um, he, again, he's trying to, like others, trying to grapple with this, why the society, right, and the state that it's in, right? He wants to understand, yes, the irrational or the mystical or the romantic, so that uh, we can somehow control it. Okay. Um, Again, the sense in Vienna is that there is a feeling of apocalypse. All right. It's an apocalypse coming to a theater soon near you. And it's almost as if we can't, Freud and some others are exceptions. They're trying to say, let's try to get to the bottom of this, right? But many people are just saying, well, this seems to be our fate. Again, there's nothing we can do about it. Let's make sure we, have the best time possible at this year's carnival and waltz, and make sure we go off for a European, that go off to a spa somewhere during the summer. And we can't really stop things from slipping over the edge. Okay, so two more points that are worth mentioning. One is the creation. What does Karl Kraus worry about? Is that out of this, right? You might say irrationalism, out of this mysticism, out of this romanticism, right? Romanticism for my language, my culture, etc., right? Emerges the new anti-Semitism. And as I mentioned to you before, anti-Semitism was, this is not the traditional Christian anti-Semitism, which in some ways theologically could have been dealt with, right, on a theological level, or on a biblical level. This now is anti-Semitism that's mixed up, right, with German nationalism. Remember, the German minority is under threat, and somehow this threat is coming not only from the Czechs and the Italians, but it's connected to the Jewish people, right? The anti-Semitism is now political, because Jews control the world and they're manipulating events, right, behind the scenes. It's economic, because the Jews are threatening us economically. They're going to take over. They're going to become all the lawyers. They're going to control the banks, so on and so forth. It's cultural. The Jews are promoting ugliness and modernity. It is, and this is where it gets really critical, it's biological. Okay? The anti-Semitism now there's nothing a Jew can do, because a Jew is a Jew is a Jew. You can't become an atheist. You can't convert to Christianity, right? Judaism is in your DNA, so to speak, and you can't convert, for example. So now there's a biological anti-Semitism, and again, is none of this makes sense, right? It's hysteria, and you see this. By the way, you see the same kind of hysteria, irrationalism, right? Today, when some people talk about Israel and they 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 become hysterical about the war, about Zionism, right? Somehow people lose any kind of their logical powers of reasoning. Now, the Jewish people in Vienna, they're very successful. They're doctors, they're lawyers, they're journalists, playwrights, musicians, right? They went along for quite some time, thinking, we've got it made here. It's something of a paradise. There's some anti-Semitism, but we're doing quite well thanks to the protection of the civil service and the emperor and so on. And then this change begins to take hold of society. And we have this modern anti-Semitism. And this anti-Semitism is, you might say, is reflected very nicely. Nicely is not the right word. And someone called Karl Lueger. Okay, he's the mayor of Vienna. Okay, and he begins life as a liberal politician, but he recognizes that the way to get ahead is, you might say, to tap into, right, the frustration of the middle class and the lower classes. So our mayor, he could speak sort of in a simple and direct way to folks who did not have a lot of education. He was very coarse and vulgar in the way that he spoke. And he appealed to those who were unemployed, those who were, right, suffering from inflation, people who were frustrated by the severe lack of housing, right, in Vienna, those that didn't have access to public health, public transportation, right? People didn't have pensions and more. And he used, again, he used anti-Semitism as an opportunity. He, in the ugliest way, condemned Jews, Judaism, Jewish tradition, right? He was, you might say, well covered. His statements, his political platform, it was well covered by what you would call the gutter press in Vienna. At the same time, he said that all the newspapers were controlled by Jews, and therefore he wasn't getting a fair deal. But actually, he got quite a bit of attention. He did use some old Christian anti-Semitic tropes, like the Jews were involved in ritual murder, right? Blood libel. I mean, in 1908, he's still talking like it's the middle. He's still talking like the Middle Ages, but he created, right? Again, you might say a whole new language and a whole new approach to anti-Semitism. He was famous for saying, Vienna is German and it must stay German. And by the way, he was just as hostile to Hungarians and Gypsies as he was to Jews. But he would then say, of course, Jews aren't German. He was once a Jewish member of the city council, protested about his incitement, and he said, "Mr. Mayor, you're quoted as saying that you know you didn't you didn't care whether all the Jews of Vienna were hanged or shot. And the mayor, got up and said, "Well, I didn't say that. I said I want to correct you. I said beheaded, right?" Or when again Jewish politicians protested his anti-Semitism, he said, "Well, anti-Semitism will end once the Jewish people the Jewish people disappeared." And he continued to. And this is what politicians like him do, and they still do to this day. They find a scapegoat and they continually, right, create resentment, right? Uh, he highlights the fact that there are poor peasants, and these poor peasants, are making furniture, and then they have to go and take what they make to Jewish department store owners, and of course they're not going to get the best price for and so on and so forth, right? So this was his tactic. He was mayor for 13 years in Vienna. At the same time, he had many Jewish friends, and he would go to their houses and eat. He would give money to poor, especially Orthodox Jews. He would do favors, for his Jewish friends, and he was criticized for being a hypocrite. And of course, uh, that was the language. That was a statement. He said, "I decide who is a Jew," right? I decide who is a Jew. And some of those who are really anti-Semites, criticized him uh, for being dishonest and not truly being an anti-Semite. And then today you have people who defend him, who said, "Well, it was just a tactic, and he was just using this for political purposes, so he wasn't really an anti-Semite," right? And the reason that is important is because in Vienna today, we have a Karl Lueger Street, and there's a statue. Here he is with pigeon poop on him, perhaps deservingly. We have there's a statue in honor of him because he did greatly help the poor and ease the housing crisis and create a system of parks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of people excused his anti-Semitism. But actually, there's no excuse for it, because even though he didn't personally believe this, he legitimized, a very demonic way of talking to about Jews. And there was a young man in Vienna who was taking all of this in. And of course, that was Adolf Hitler, who attended his funeral when he died in 1910. And Hitler thought he made two mistakes, right? One mistake was he appeased the Catholic Church, and you should never appease any religious group, Hitler thought. And secondly, his anti-Semitism wasn't biological enough, right? It was social, cultural, economic, political, right? But there were others in Vienna that thought in biological terms. Okay, and our last, going back to Karl Kraus, we talked about psychoanalysis and ethnic hatred and more extremist ideas, is occultism. And going to just talk for a few minutes more about this man here. This is the godfather of the modern European return to paganism. His name is Guido von List. Guido von List came from a middle-class background, but according to his testimony, which may or may not be true, I don't know. According to his testimony, he says that when he was a youngster, he was in the St. Stephen's Cathedral. That's the church you see at the right. He was in the crypt. He was in what you might call the basement, where they have a number of graves or tombs, right, for dignitaries and clergy and saints. And he saw something that looked like a ruined altar. And as a young man, he went there and he knelt down and he said, this was an altar originally to Wotan, right? A pagan god that was worshipped in Europe before the arrival of Christianity. And somehow he has an encounter with something dark, and he dedicates his life to the overthrow of Christianity. Okay. So starting in the 1880s and 1890s, he becomes you might say, a private scholar. He's not associated with any university. He becomes a novelist, a playwright, and he starts to write about German society before, Christianity came. And he has all these revisionist, even kooky ideas that these Germans were called Aryans, and that these Aryans had a civilization superior to Rome, that they practice some form of racial purity. They wouldn't breed with non-Aryans. They even kept records of, who was their wife, who they married, and what children they had, so on and so forth. And he began to have visions, and began to understand that really the enemy of the Aryan people, the ones who are stopping the Aryans from returning to greatness. And he actually believed that the Aryans had godlike powers, right, at one time, right? They were semi-divine, or they had some form of divinity, but they lost that divinity because they started to mix, right, with other so-called races. And of course, the real enemy of the Aryan people, it was first of all, it's Christianity in general, because Christianity, taught that one should be humble and modest, right, and of course love, and the reason Christianity somehow subverted the Aryans was because we were jealous, because they were so powerful, and so he again began to promote this notion, or this idea of right, Aryan supremacy. He popularized the swastika as being the symbol of the Aryan people, or the Aryan man, right? And now, virtually none of these ideas were original. He borrowed a lot of them from Madame Blavatsky, who was a New Age figure, the mother of theosophy, and she borrowed them from Hinduism and from Tibetan Buddhism. And Guido von List thought that every stream and every mountain in the German countryside, there was a god associated, a pagan deity associated with nature, and that he had to identify these pagan deities, and they needed to be worshipped, and so forth. Now, all of this is done. All of his center, his base, is in Vienna, and his approach, right? Let's go back to a religion before Christianity, because again, Christianity, along with the Roman Catholic Church and the Jesuits and the Freemasons, are all are all enemies. Um, we, we need to return to racial purity and reject Christianity, and recreate the religion that existed here the before Saint Paul, who was a Jew, came and subverted Europe on behalf of this, by the way, this Jewish plot or this Jewish conspiracy. And further, he had this strong belief that there was going to be something apocalyptic. Now, everybody in Vienna felt this, right? Many secular people felt like they're on the edge of this abyss. Even William Henry Heschler, the one who ended up helping Herzl, felt like there's something prophetic or something big that's going to happen soon. The age in which he lived, and he believed that there was going to be a big, huge war between the Aryans and the non-Aryans, and this war was going to lead to the Aryans returning somehow to their godlike status or semi-divine status. And they also found a a piece of poetry that sounded like a prophecy that came from a piece of Nordic literature, right, of the 11th century. And he began to make this his mantra. Okay, Ben, if you can put it up. This is our last slide, I think. Okay, nope. All right. So this he began to, right, he foresaw, he began to foresee that, again, we're on the edge of an apocalyptic crisis, and he started to form secret cells or secret societies all across Europe, based, or to be prepared, right, for this eventuality. And he modeled these secret societies on the Freemasons. He hated the Freemasons, but he thought, well, they were organizational geniuses. And this prophecy went as follows. A wealthy man joins a circle of counselors. A strong one from above ends the factions. He settles everything with fair decisions. Whatever he ordains shall endure forever. And he begins to interpret this. Again, it's a piece of poetry that he turns into some kind of a prophecy, right? He begins to interpret this as that some strong man is going to come from above, right? He's going to be somehow superhuman, or what semi-divine. He's going to come from above. He's going to end the factions, meaning he's going to end divisions. He's going to be one who brings unity. He will never be wrong. Okay, he's whatever he does is going to end up being right. And this person is going to have some divine connection, and this is the expectation that goes throughout many circles in Europe, especially those who probably weren't, committed to a biblical worldview or even a denominational worldview. They're looking for now some kind of messianic deliverance, and it's going to come with a war. And so when the First World War started, our buddy Guido von List, he thought that this was the apocalyptic war that he was waiting for, right? And he writes, amid the jubilation of the liberated godmen, we would conquer the whole planet. The fire should be raked until sparks fly from the barrels, German battleships, and flashes start from German cannon. An order is created among the quarrelsome Udamundand, or the subhumans, the non-Aryans, right? And throughout the war, it's interesting, his swastika became something like a good luck charm. And those soldiers that were perhaps the most nationalistic would be wearing, that symbol, on putting it on their helmets or on their equipment and so on and so forth. What we what we know from all this is that Guido von List, who brought about a revival of the occult and these esoteric historical views, he had many students who followed him, and these ideas grew and became popular. We also know that Adolf Hitler himself was quite up on these theories, right? And while Hitler was not an occultist, and he didn't go in for seances or any kind of magic, and he wasn't a Satan worshiper, he was influenced by Guido von List, yes, in several areas. One, simply, he takes the swastika and makes it the symbol of his movement. Two, the whole theory about the Aryan and racial purity and racial mixing, he adopts. And three, there are many scholars, not many, but a number of scholars who believe that this strong one from above that becomes very popular is somehow at least partially responsible for Hitler as seeing himself, like as he understands himself as a gift given to the German people by providence. And by providence, he means by nature itself. He doesn't mean by God, or he wasn't talking about Providence, Rhode Island. And that he can never make a mistake, and he never has to apologize. So this hubris, or this self-confidence that he has, right, certainly in part comes from psychologically and politically from other corners. But, again, being aware of this prophecy, the so-called prophecy that Guido von List promotes and writes about extensively, and then holds out these expectations like for this false messianic redemption, right? It's a false understanding of the apocalypse. It's a false understanding of redemption. Guido von List dreams of a paradise, but it's a paradise for the Aryan only. And for this paradise to come into existence, it means the death of millions and millions of people, right? So it's quite a perverted understanding. So you might say that the launching pad that pushed Hitler towards becoming an idol, right? Not an American idol, but that created the idolatry that surrounded him. Again, could be found in Vienna. Okay, that's Vienna, the laboratory of world destruction, according to Karl Kraus. And let's just open it for questions if there are any. Yeah. So,
David, how old was Hitler while this was going on?
Hitler was, I think when he went to Vienna, he was 18. And he stayed from 1908 till, he went to Vienna in 1908, and he stayed at 1913. So he was in Vienna 5 years. So he was 23 or 24 when he left and moved to Munich. and then he enlisted, of course, um, in the German army and fought in the First World War. Okay, so he was a young, impressionable 18-year-old. Before he went to Vienna, most of these ideas that many of his rudimentary ideas and his worldview was formed in Vienna. Okay, it was formed by being in contact, and he was a voracious reader, and he spent time talking to people and and debating and observing. And Hitler wasn't stupid. Some people think. So he absorbs, the anti-Semitism, the hatred for democracy, the hatred for Vienna itself because he feels like it's too diverse and has too many races, right? Hatred for the Jews, so on and so forth.
Do we know that much about his formative years? Because I know, like in Vienna, he wanted to get, he wasn't good enough, to get into art school, and so that goal was taken away from him. That was my understanding. But what was it like before, when, like, as far as him growing up? Any
Well,
influence from his parents
yes,
or?
we know a fair bit about Hitler and his family, and it is quite interesting. Although you have to separate, fact from fiction. We do know a good bit. He he had a talent for drawing, especially drawing buildings. But the thing about Hitler, he he was incredibly lazy, or he somehow expected it to fall out of the sky. He was given an interview at the Academy of Art in the Schillerplatz in Vienna, and he wasn't accepted. And then he had a friend of a friend who knew a leading professor there, and he said, "Look, you can have an interview and get a second chance." And it's not as if he went out and then asked people to critique his work and then asked, "What can I do to improve?" Or he didn't do any of that, right? He was uh, he was convinced that he was an artist or he was going to be an artist, and it was going to all happen through some kind of willpower. You didn't have to prepare for it. He just, it was just somehow going to happen to him. So there's quite an extraordinary book called Hitler's Vienna. It was written by Bridget Hamann, and she really, really describes what Vienna was like and how Hitler lived, which in many cases he was virtually starving to death, right, because of um, his lack of resources and so on. So. Other questions?
David, so I think that there might be some I'd be interested to hear about the relationships between the kind of the different types of anti-Semites, because it seems to me that there was one kind of more sort of kind of old-fashioned conservative, maybe more connected to Christianity, but kind of more
Right,
kind of a classic nationalist. And then
right,
there was this more sort of esoteric, kind of mystical kind of anti-Semitism, and they seem that, they would oppose each other, at least to some degree.
right. Well, you did have, look, you had many anti-Semites, right, who were a conservative, from a conservative, like the conservative order, and maybe they were theological anti-Semites, like in a more of a traditional Christian sense, but largely, and this needs some clarification, that was it was somewhat passive, and it wasn't murderous. Okay, it was yes, you're an anti-Semite and you're not going to buy from this Jewish store, or you're going to tell a Jewish joke. But what happens with anti-Semitism is when anti-Semitism mixes with nationalism, right? Or when anti-Semitism, right, mixes with your somehow the need for you to establish an identity, or anti-Semitism mixes with conspiracy theories, right? You know, what really becomes dangerous is anti-Semitism and something else, right? So you have anti-Semitism in this mayor, Karl Lueger, and what does he do? He's improving the city. He's building parks. He's establishing clinics for poor people. Oh, let's overlook his anti-Semitism. Or, you know, here comes a great guy, Adolf Hitler. He's going to fix our problems. He's going to put us all back to work again. He's going to restore our humiliation and, you know, give us our honor back. He's going to give us purpose and community, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, and he's an anti-Semite. Okay, well, if he's an anti-Semite, you know, in order for Germany to have in order for us to have our dignity restored after World War I and Versailles, we'll just go along with the guy, right? Because people didn't vote for Hitler because he was an anti-Semite, right? In fact, he kind of suppressed that when he was, you know, when he was running, right? So yes, it's the anti-Semitism and something else, especially, and I don't make this clear, especially when someone like Karl Lueger, it's not that he combines all these things. He combines all these things and he knows how to manipulate the press, and he knows how to use images, and he knows how to use languages, and he knows how to use mass rallies, right? This is the beginning of sort of, you know, mass politics, right? Now, all of a sudden, thousands of people can hear the mayor talk about how bad the Jews are. Before in history, you never had anything like this, right? And of course, then the Nazis become like the communists, they become masters at using papers and radio and then film, and so on and so forth, in order to carry on this fight, right? So you're right, Yahel. There's anti-Semitism. No anti-Semitism is good, but there are forms of anti-Semitism that mix, for example, with extreme anti-Zionism, and that becomes dangerous, right? That's how we lost our friend Yaron Lisinski in Washington, D.C., right? Because of you know, this kind of you know, this kind of thing, right? And it could be the left, it could be the right, but watch out when it mixes with something else. Okay.
David,
Mm-hmm.
what were the voices? Where were the voices speaking against us back then? It seems that everybody was just kind of ignoring it. But and second question, just out of curiosity, this pagan abyss that this Guido fellow opened, it seems never to have been shut. It seems to be growing bigger and bigger even today. Maybe you can speak on that.
Look, with the decline of Christianity in Europe, people assume that one would stop being religious, but human beings on the whole don't stop being religious. They just trade one religion for another, and in some cases they traded Christian practice and belief for you know, the International, for Marxism, or for some form of nationalism, or you know, for some kind of mysticism, right? Like was being offered and is still very popular in some forms, like with the New Age movement, and so forth, right? Um, so yes, you have a human need for, I think, for religiosity, and it might skip a generation, but it doesn't skip 2 or 3 generations. Okay, who was speaking up against this? Well, you had people who were trying to warn, and of course, those folks were never very popular. So you had our man William Heschler, who believed that also the Jews were on the verge of a disaster and that many hundreds of thousands would be killed. He didn't predict the Holocaust. And you had another woman, Bertha von Suttner was her name, and she tried to promote peace and disarmament. But of course, no one's going to listen to her because she's a naive pacifist, or she's naive, and of course, we need to keep our standing army and to et cetera, et cetera. What I didn't mention, David, so much was that all of this ends up, with World War I, and the people of Europe, whether it was in Austria or Germany, France, maybe less so in Britain, when the war started, it's as if something broke, right? People felt somehow stuck. They felt, it's like you're waiting for the shoe to drop, and that when the shoe finally drops, you're relieved, right? You're relieved that this is finally happening. And on top of that, people in Europe felt like their lives were drab and boring, right? So the war comes and it brings a sense of, togetherness, and it brings a sense of adventure and excitement, and it brings the death of millions of people, right? And that is ultimately the disaster that Karl Kraus was worried about, right? He wasn't thinking of the Holocaust. He didn't know that a young Adolf Hitler was there, sort of metaphorically taking, very copious notes, right, from Viennese society. Okay.
Yes.
And, even if we don't like Max Weber, or we don't like Sigmund Freud, or I don't like Max Nordau, all these people they were just worried, about the way that, that society was going. Not to defend the positivist, or I'm not a positivist, but at the same time, what is it that we can do to stand against, you might say, the same kind of insanity, right, that you see sweeping the world today, right? There's the same sort of, it's not history repeating itself, but it's the same pattern. There's the same escape into being irrational, being mystical, and I think a certain amount of mysticism is good. Everything is a conspiracy theory, and we have to have a scapegoat, because we're not going to, to be responsible, and we have to look after ourselves, because and look after our own group, right? So you have this, right, return, maybe it never left, return to sort of ethnic struggle and hatred, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, and things are such a huge mess. We need one man or a woman to come along and to cut through the the stagnation, and to get things done for us, right? All these temptations are still with us, and I reckon if we take a shortcut, that more often than not, the cure will be worse than the disease, right? German conservatives, and that thought, well, we can toy with Hitler and use him, to achieve our political ends, and then when we're finished with him, we'll just toss him in the, in the garbage can, right? And that's how they let him into power. Initially gave him some cabinet seats, and of course, within months, he had toyed with them and pretty much thrown them into the rubbish. Okay, so yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions?
David,
Yes.
one of the statements that you made early on was about how much the pictures in the newspapers began to influence people, the seeing the images. What do you think of that in today's situation with your phone and all that's
What do
available?
I think? I think we're descending into hell in a way, because what started right, what was a natural desire, right, to see things visually, right? We have now, right, because of the, well, it's the same same problem, right? Right. People back then, even Karl Kraus, always complained about the press. The press is this, the press is lying to us, the press is not telling us the whole truth. Well, there's no doubt there is some truth to that critique. But now we've gone from a place where everyone can publish. Everyone now is their own publisher and their own editor, right? It can be a blog, it can be a website, it's a TikTok account, and it doesn't rely a lot on information. It simply largely relies on visuals. And we've come to a place where we can be more manipulated as a society than ever before, right? And people who don't take the time to read or to discuss or to examine will end up being, if we're not on the road already, enslaved by an ideology, a political system, a corporation, or even by, ultimately, I don't want to sound like I'm scaremongering, but by AI itself. Okay.
Yeah.
If there's no control over AI, and there's not an international agreement that we're putting severe restrictions on AI. My son-in-law, who's something of a world expert on the subject now, he reckons that within 50 years, AI will have us in zoos.
Yes.
Yeah. Any suggestions as to how we stand up to anti-Semitism? Just on that thing of anybody can publish, but yet in the national media, not anybody can publish. Only sometimes a one-sided version is given, as we see here in Ireland. You cannot get publication of anything positive about Israel these days.
Yeah, I would. Yeah. Anyone, what to do about this? I mean, you do have, right? You do have the ability, right, to publish, and the fact that if people can publish something that's substantial and balanced. I mean, we have the positive side of all this is that no one has a monopoly, on no one has a monopoly on publication as it once happened. But mind you, there is a huge amount. We should be aware of this. There is an incredibly huge amount of false information. It is being spread by countries like Venezuela and Iran and Turkey and it is and Russia. Russia, for example, plays a really double game. In Israel, in Hebrew, it does everything possible to support Netanyahu. Outside of Israel and other languages, right, it's involved in trying to blacken the name of the state of Israel at every opportunity. And may I just warn everybody before I go back to anti-Semitism that we have to stop thinking in terms of left wing and right wing anymore. Right? The game is so changed that you can be a conservative or a liberal, right? But you're a conservative or a liberal that wants to live by the rule of law, that wants to have a government and civic institutions that are transparent. You want to have limits on authority. You want to live in a society that doesn't condone corruption. And that's what's at stake. And you can be a liberal, like you can be a leftist like Venezuela, or some kind of right-wing Muslim regime like Turkey. And this is what we're facing. So we have to really stand against fake news. I think if, and maybe my son who's listening to this, I think there are ways to use social media to promote, to fight against anti-Semitism. I don't know if we have the time here. There are ways to be creative in doing this, and even, you might say, even shocking, or to shock people in order to do this. But it's really, I'm going to have to think about something like Ireland. Okay, I'm gonna. I want to. I mean, I know the hostility there is unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know where my son Benjamin is, but maybe he has something, some ideas. And by the way, it is kind of hard with this government in Israel. It is not easy to defend everything Israel does. It's very personally disconcerting, and I think it's disconcerting to quite a few people.
Yeah.
But yeah, ask me that question next week. Okay. Any other questions?
David, I just have one question, maybe a follow-up question. So interested in this atmosphere, how, of course, you're just presented us brilliantly. Help us, think about this. And Beethoven lists how he's an influencer for Hitler, but he's not a real. Hitler doesn't seem to be a true believer, as you're saying. But I wonder about other Nazis like Goebbels. I mean, some of the things that we hear is that he was a little bit more dedicated to this. And then the follow-up question that always bothers me is, the Christians in Germany or others, the Deutsche Christen, the German national Christians. I mean, one commentary of the Bible I like from, was Adolf Schlatter, for instance. And, some people argue it, but I've heard good words. That 1939, he has a picture of Adolf Hitler in his office. It's, how can, it just seems like there were so many Christians that supported him. Of course, we like to talk about Bonhoeffer and so many others, the confessing church that opposed him. But it seems like there's this occult background, and at the same time, you get the nationalism and some German Christians that you think would be smart enough not to support him. So I kind of have two questions in there. Sir, really enjoyed this presentation very much, I want to say.
Okay, so look, you're absolutely, first of all, there's the Arthurson family who are from Scotland, and they don't live very far from a place in Scotland where Rudolf Hess, came down in his Messerschmitt. He took off in what, 1940, and 1941, in April of 1941, he taught himself how to fly. He took off from Augsburg, and without radar, I think, flew pretty much to Sharon, help me if I'm wrong. The estate wanted the state of Lord Hamilton, who he thought would be it. Now, why did he make that journey? Because he was a mystic, and he somehow had some kind of astrological sign or some kind of mystical impulse that told him before Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, he needed to try to go to he needed to go to England, to try to Britain, to make peace, to offer a peace deal. So there were here's what you have to think of. The Nazi movement is very broad, right? It's very big, and you have different elements you had elements in the Nazi movement. They were sort of antinomian. They wanted to free society from its bourgeois foundations, right? They wanted to have sexual freedom, and they're almost like communists. They wanted to suck it to the rich, and to raise up the poor, and then you had others who were very very, very conservative, right? Who wanted to keep the established order. And you had those within the Nazi movement, especially in the beginning, like Himmler and like Hess, who were true believers in the occult and in mysticism. They somehow tried to contact, pagan deities, and Himmler and the SS had all kinds of rites and rituals that had some connection with a pagan past. And then you had others who thought it was all nonsense, right? And there was always this tension, between the mystics and those who were more pragmatically minded. The one thing they really had in common, they all hated Jews. Okay. They all hated, they all understood this racial, right? The racial problems. The Nazis were the revolutionaries of the 20th century. All right. Right. You can say, but about the communists? Communists actually are the late 19th century. The Nazis the issue becomes race, right? And this isn't new in human history, but the way that they played it up and they made it so essential was probably new and revolutionary. Okay. And by the way, where did they get this from? They got it from the Marxists. The Marxists, right? They believed in this struggle or this conflict between classes, between rich, poor, the proletariat, the bourgeoisie, blah, 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 right? The world was in a state of conflict. The world was messed up because of the class struggle, right? And for Freud, there was a struggle, but the struggle was in your soul, right? You had to overcome. On one hand, you had to deal with your obsession, your repression, right? Whatever. And then you had to resubmit yourself to repression. So that all of that was a struggle for him. And for the Nazis, it was the struggle between races. Okay. And in two of the three cases, you can thank the influence of Charles Darwin. As for the churches, there is a major failure. There was a major Christian failure. Shame on us that the churches in Germany so desired, right, this relief from national humiliation. They wanted a political solution to their problems, and most Lutheran churches supported Hitler. The Catholics were a little more hesitant and reserved and kept the distance somewhat, but on the whole, it was a pretty sad and poor record. And once Hitler was well in power, he pretty much had the churches under his control, and there was nothing they could do. The German Christians and others missed the opportunity before Hitler came into power. That's when he should have been stopped. Okay, but either people were too busy or too apathetic, and many people thought, this guy, he's a kook. He's never, someone will shoot him. He won't last very long. And of course, he surprises everybody, right? By having a 12-year reign of terror that ends up leading to the death of 45 million people. Okay. So yes, we have a few Bonhoeffers and some others. And maybe on the tour, we'll talk about how people, even afterwards, could have resisted Hitler. Maybe not in the same way, but they didn't. Even dictators like Hitler was concerned about public opinion. Okay. Other questions?
Thank you. Thank you.
Maybe someone can ask a short question like, what is the weather like in Jerusalem or something? I don't know.
I have a short question. I want to know, is the next lecture, which is on July 12th, is that the same time as scheduled as this one?
It's the same time. Yep.
Okay.
It's the same time. And Philip's a great speaker, and he's got great insights, and especially being a little bit, he's been part of Poland for a long time, but he's a little bit of an outsider. And so sometimes outsiders or people who are on the edge are better observers of things. So he's got some good insights into Polish-Jewish relations and Catholic-Polish relations, and right, Poland's conversion to Christianity and more. Yeah. So
Thank you,
okay.
David.
You're welcome, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you,
And
David.
I hope, I don't know who asked me the question. Who is the question from Ireland? So who is
It's me,
that?
Alison.
Oh, Alison. Sorry, because all I see is St. Stephen's Cathedral. I'm sorry. I can't.
I don't know how that is. It's not